Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for spending your Wednesday evening with us. My name is Lynn Mattis, pronouns she and her, and I'm an alumni coordinator at Mohawk College. The Alumni Relations Department is here to support graduating students and alumni in helping you stay connected with the Mohawk community through events like this, communications, alumni benefits, volunteering, and more. Now, before we get started with today's workshop, while we are gathering in a virtual environment today, I would like to take a moment to honor the land we are on and those who shared it before us. Mohawk College campuses and where I reside in Mississauga is situated on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations, within lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, and is currently home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. Recognizing there remains much work to be done in improving this relationship, I understand the importance of my own personal commitment to actively work to unlearn my bias, be open to listening, and continue to grow my knowledge and understanding of history and Indigenous cultures. It is now my pleasure to introduce our facilitator for today's workshop, Louis Perdico. Louis is a senior therapist at Shift Collab, one of Canada's largest therapy practices. As a registered social worker and facilitator, Louis focuses on the exploration of identity, inclusion, communication, and the healing of trauma. Louis has delivered workshops to a wide range of educational institutions and corporate teams looking to explore these themes. Welcome, Louis. We are so excited to have you guide us through this important discussion today. I know we have a great hour ahead of us, so I will go ahead and pass the mic over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Lynn, and excited to be here with all of you. Thank you for hosting me here. Alrighty, so what we are talking about today is practicing everyday allyship or practicing critical allyship. So I'll do a little introduction for myself as well. Thank you, Lynn, for doing that. My name's Louis Perdico. My pronouns are he, him, they, whatever rolls off the tongue for you best. I'm totally okay with. And to break it down to a simple sentence, I help people navigate their mental health and explore identity. So I'm a registered social worker with the Ontario College of Social Workers and Social Service Workers, and I'm a clinical therapist with Shift Collab. I'm a queer and a Black therapist, and my professional background as a social worker has spanned most age groups in the mental health and addictions field. I currently live up in Laurentian. I currently live up in Sudbury, Ontario, and came to the beautiful city several years ago to do my undergraduate degree in social work. I lived in Ottawa for a couple of years to do my master's degree over there, and very happy to call Sudbury, Ontario my home. I've been doing equity work through my practice at Shift Collab, through my practice as well in NGOs, as well as kind of in grad school around that time is when I started working to support organizations to access what was then the Ontario Black Youth Action Plan. So this is my second year as a consultant as well with the Equity Integration Advisory Group for the Ontario Association of Social Workers, and I consult with the Equity Committee with Shift Collab. As Lynn highlighted in my practice, I primarily work with racialized Black queer folks around pieces of identity and trauma, and really how to navigate systems that were not traditionally created for our bodies or identities. So I'm very happy to get to continue my equity work and bringing new information to folks such as yourselves through workshops like this. So for myself as well, I like to include a land acknowledgement, particularly as well because we're talking about critical allyship, we're talking about inclusion, we're talking about how to build safety. And I'm committed to diversity, to equity, to inclusion, and anti-racism. So knowing where we are, knowing that the land was stolen that we use, that it's never belonged to us, why it was stolen, how it was stolen, is really quite important when we're understanding ourselves and we're understanding critical allyship in that practice. So the land that I am giving this presentation on today is in the Robinson Huron Treaty Territory, and it's the traditional territory of the Atitmikshing and Anishinaabe. And Shift's head office is located in the ancestral traditional territories of the Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, which is covered in the Upper Canada Treaties. If you are ever interested in looking to find out what land you happen to be on, there's a really great website called who's.land. You can literally type in your address and it gives you lots of really valuable information for you to explore and find out a little bit about. So some of the conversations we're going to have today might be heavy, might be a little bit difficult at times. Either way, it's lots of information. So it's really important for us to kind of enter into this space well together, or enter into this space mindfully. The virtual shared learning space, a little bit different than what we're used to over the past couple of years, is kind of it. So it's always a good thing to enter into the space in the best way we possibly can. So I like to do a little bit of a breathing exercise, a little bit of a grounding exercise, so we're all coming in fresh on the same level. So I'm just going to lead us through this exercise. As we're going through, just a quick lesson in breathing. As you're inhaling, we want you to breathe in through the nose, and you're actually going to be trying to push your stomach out as if you're inflating a balloon in there. As you're exhaling, you're going to be pushing out of your mouth and pulling that stomach back in as if you are deflating a balloon. So we're just doing that so we're getting nice deep breaths through our diaphragm, getting the most amount of oxygen in, getting that good oxygen into our lungs, blood oxygenated and flowing, so that we can come to a grounded place to move into this together. So to start us out, everyone can just make themselves comfortable wherever you happen to be, sitting, standing, lying down, walking, wherever that might be. Close your eyes if it is comfortable or safe to do so. And I'm just going to invite you to start taking a deep breath in through the nose and exhale. One more breath in through the nose and exhale. As you keep breathing, I'm just going to invite you to imagine there's a bright, warm light coming down, just touching the top of your head. That light can be any color that you would like it to be, any color that you associate with grounding or healing. I'm just going to ask you to notice the warmth of that light as it just touches down at the top. With each deep breath, notice how the light moves its way slowly down over your body. Just going from your head down to your toes. Notice how, as that light moves down to cover your body, any place where you find tension, tightness, or discomfort, that warmth, that light touches on and relieves some of that. Notice how, as the light reaches your feet, with each breath, it pulses with you, bringing more healing, more grounding. And I'm going to invite you just to allow that light to either start to sink into you or to just dissipate away, whatever imagination works for you. Notice perhaps as it sinks in that you attach it to your heart and to your mind as a reminder of the light, the healing, and the warmth. As it drifts away, perhaps noticing so do those tensions or discomforts in your muscles. And with one final deep breath, I'll invite everybody just to come back to the moment here. Okay, hopefully you're able to participate, maybe feeling a little bit more of a grounded level. See a comment in there, this was good, thank you very much. Glad it was well received. All right, so I'm just going to start out with an ask for you folks, and simply, what do you know about allyship? Can type it into the chat box if there's anything that's particularly coming to mind. You can unmute yourself if you want to shout it out. We're a small group today, so not too many people talking over each other, so if there is something you'd like to say out loud as well, feel free to. And if there is nothing, you are probably in the right workshop then today. So I'm happy to have you all here. And we will be hopefully learning lots together. Hopefully we'll have some things to maybe question or have some dialogue about closer towards 7:30. All right. So my intention today with this workshop is to help you understand why practicing allyship is essential. I'm assuming that all of you folks are here because you want to learn how to create a more inclusive environment and practice allyship. I did get a comment in the chat box there. So helping a group of people overcome barriers while acknowledging that they are the ones who must lead the process. Absolutely. Thank you for typing that in. That last line, they are the ones who must lead the process, right? There is no practice of critical allyship without the group that you are trying to support. It just simply cannot happen. Wouldn't make any sense. So thank you for giving that for us there. So here on this screen, you're going to just see some different ways of practicing allyship. But first, we want to redefine maybe what the traditional sense of allyship is. Because declaring yourself an ally really, unfortunately, does not mean much. And what we might think when we first say the word ally doesn't really exist. So practicing allyship is actively opposing forces of oppression, is acting in a compassionate way, and it is relating to others and treating them as human beings. So you may be called on and you can be called on to practice allyship. This means that you either stand beside, in front, or behind a community. And as we got volunteered in the chat, you have to listen to know when each of those is needed, and it has to be with the community. So beside could be something like, as we started this workshop, I volunteered my pronouns. If I was talking to somebody, such as sitting with a client in session, typically we start out with me volunteering my pronouns and asking how I can refer to them. If we're looking at in front of, we might be providing a correction to somebody and saying, hey, you know what, the way you referred to such and such a person or the way that you did this was not appropriate. Behind is really that piece as well of I'm here to support, what can I do, what is needed from me. So we're going to talk a little bit about theory. Hopefully not too much of a boring part. All exists here for a reason. So there are systemic forces that work for some people while they actually work against other people. And this is what we call privilege. Privilege is not usually something that you ask for. So the coin model here is a model that shows us basically how privilege and oppression exist. So structural oppression is an type of oppression that's embedded in all of our institutions that are public and private. So that's in government, in schools, in hospitals, in basically any system you can think of. There is some type of structural oppression embedded in there. Structural oppression contributes to lower health outcomes, lower quality of life, a lower life expectancy, as well as higher levels of psychological distress. And this is across the board, not necessarily just to the people who are perhaps on the oppression side of this coin model. So as you can see on the screen here, individual actions is not something that's reflected in the model. We're just specifically looking at the systems of inequality or where the structural oppression exists. So the top of the coin, you can see in the green, is where there's advantage, where you did not earn that advantage, and that you have it just because of who you happen to be. So this is where our privilege comes in. Bottom part of the coin is where the oppression is, which is very similar in those similar words, but it's disadvantage instead, and you have it still because of who you happen to be. That system, that structure is existing as the coin. So the example could be the coin of heterosexism. So this is the belief that everyone is heterosexual, that heterosexuality is intrinsically better than other sexualities, or that other sexualities are flawed. So people who fit into this structure enjoy the privilege that comes along with it and living with a society and within structures that have been historically built for heterosexuality without fear of any sort of discrimination or violence based on sexuality. The flip side of the coin is the oppression. So the same as some people receive advantage for living in this system, others receive disadvantage. So this slide on critical allyship here, if you look at this coin, there's all of these different identities around. This image is representing some of these systems, not all of them, that might intersect. So we can't even just consider one coin. It gets a little bit more complicated where we've got to consider all of these coins and all of these systems that might actually intersect, where we could have both privilege and oppression in one area or another. So in the model, it truly does not matter which side of the coin you are on. The goal is not to move somebody from one side of a coin to another, either from oppression to privilege or privilege to oppression. Either way, then an inequitable system exists. The goal is to dismantle the system entirely. So it's important to understand that the bottom of the coin is disadvantaged compared to the top of the coin. Either side is unfair, like I said, either side is inequitable. And if we acknowledge just one or the other, the intervention is not going to be sufficient enough, and the equitable system's just going to sit there. Nothing's going to change. So why does this matter to me? The coin model tells us why and how systems of oppression actually exist. So a little personal anecdote that I like to share is, at times, currently not, I wear my hair in twists. So this is just a protective style used by Black folks to protect our curls from the elements. And it's often a stylistic choice. So sometimes I twist the hair attached to my head, so I have short twists. Sometimes I use hair that I weave in and have longer twists. Sometimes I have my hair out in an afro, maybe pulled back like it is right now. So I had a situation where I went for blood work, of all places, to check up on some health stuff, walked in, sat in the chair, arm out. The nurse, phlebotomist, I guess, comes in to take my blood. And the very first thing they do is just exclaim very loudly, "Wow, I love your hair," which is so lovely, so nice. The next thing they did before I could even respond, though, was to reach over and grab my hair, which I don't know when that became appropriate, but in this moment, it apparently did. I'm not somebody that's easily made speechless. In that moment, I was definitely speechless. I'm also not a person who loves needles, so not one that's typically going to talk back to somebody who's about to put a needle in my arm. Then the person laughed and said, "Oh, I probably shouldn't be touching you." And I was like, okay, you know what? They get it. They understand that this was inappropriate. Here comes the apology. And then the next thing I got from them was COVID rules, you know, and then they kind of giggled. I was like, okay, so we were close, but we missed the boat. It wasn't quite what we were looking for there. Then they turn around and pick up the needle and start to go through the form with all of my personal health information on it. So they also then started to comment on how they knew that it wasn't my hair, how it was fake hair, and how it must be so nice to wear fake hair. And yes, sure, it was not attached to my head, but I bought the hair, so it was my hair. And it's also never been appropriate to go and comment on what somebody's really looking like, what their appearance is. If I'm not going to snatch your toupee, don't comment on my hair. It's in a system like this where I really wanted to walk out because it was uncomfortable. It was embarrassing to be made a spectacle of in this little cubicle with all these other people around. Ultimately, though, I needed the work done. I needed to do my health check. And if I had left there, I would have missed out on an important healthcare opportunity. So even in this, this simple act of going to get my blood taken, there was the power of this person, the privilege of this person and their identity, with their racial identity, their identity as in their job, where they held a significant level of power over whether or not basically I was going to access healthcare, and were able to say, pretty much whatever they wanted to me. So this is not somebody who is practicing allyship, unfortunately. I no longer had the right to feel safe or security of my person because they decided they could just put their hands on me, which is never appropriate. It's never appropriate in any case, but this person decided they didn't need my consent or my permission just because something was different. So this sort of work, I share this to say it matters because it's literally everywhere, right? We have to consider every single thing we do. And often the people who exist in identities that maybe differ from the quote unquote norm or where most structures were built for have to consider these things a lot more. And that, it's an unfortunate reality of the world that we live in. Um, doesn't make it correct, doesn't make it proper, but just want to share this is why it's real. So here are some statistics to continue to make it even a little bit more real. So 5.5 million Canadians received healthcare for mental health services in 2016-2017. And then 9.1 million Canadians, which is 1 in 3, are going to be affected by mental illness in their lifetime. 1 in 3 is not an insignificant amount of people who will be affected by mental illness. So in 2009, 15.4% of Canadians over the age of 15 reported experiences of discrimination, and perceived discrimination actually increased the likelihood of both physical and mental health problems. And research evidence is actually suggesting that the experience of unfair treatment, rather than the experience of discrimination, rather than the reason for discrimination, is the thing that's responsible for psychological distress. So it is not necessarily that, whatever the reason is. So just because, I'm Black and went in to get my blood work, it does not mean that my psychological distress is because I'm Black and I went in to get blood work. The psychological distress comes from the fact that I experienced unfair treatment. So someone who is queer or Black or any other intersecting identity isn't more likely to have mental health concerns based on being queer or Black or anything else, but actually based on the attitudes, beliefs, and the unfair treatment from people around them. So in these stats, the Mental Health Commission of Canada and the Public Health Agency of Canada, both across the board, identified that when it came to diversity populations of immigrants, lesbian, gay, and bisexual people and residents of northern communities, the health indicators for anxiety, for mood disorders, for discrimination, stress, and self-rated mental health were worse overall than the general population. I do want to acknowledge that there is certainly barriers in the research that was pulled here, and there's a lot of communities that are missing. So 71% is the percentage of Canadians 12 years or older with common mental health conditions that reported in 2011-2012 that they worked at a job or business. So given what we know here, looking at these stats about the rate of mental health concerns among more diverse populations due to the psychological distress that accompanies discrimination, the rate of Canadians in the workforce with mental health conditions, it could be said that employers, the public, colleges at all levels actually have a vested interest in practicing allyship so that we can maintain our workforce, our economy, and we can attract the most talented and diverse of ideas from people who come from all walks of life and from all schools of thought. From my personal experience, I've walked away from relationships, workplaces, even family that were not willing to acknowledge my humanity through identity. I work with people every day who are struggling with both physically and who are struggling both physically and mentally rather to navigate structures such as workplaces, government, healthcare, forms even, while facing systems of oppression that are entrenched in all of our most common structures. And that is causing very real harm and sometimes even trauma to people. So let's talk about language. This part's hopefully a little bit lighter. So these are some of the terms that you might hear me use as I go through the workshop. Maybe you've already heard me use. It's really important to highlight that some of these things are not terms that everyone uses, and these are the definitions of how I'm going to be using them. There's a lot of nuance sometimes to some of these terms. So we're looking at allyship, which is a position of moral responsibility to advocate for members of the group and actively work against oppression. Queer is the umbrella term that I'm going to use for those who are non-cisgender, non-heterosexual. Again, queer is one of those terms that I use. Not everybody is comfortable with the use of the term queer, and there are a lot of historically negative connotations to the use of that word. Racialized is a term for people who are non-white, which is rooted in the fact that barriers faced are current and historical context. Indigenous is a collective name for the original people of Canada. Black, a collective name for people of African and Caribbean descent. A minority, a group of people whose practices, race, religion, ethnicity, or other characteristics are fewer in number than the larger groups of those classifications. And then we have, skipped ahead. Then we have the term BIPOC. So BIPOC is a term that has kind of come up quite a lot over the past few years. Mostly kind of started in the US and moved its way into Canada and throughout the world. To use the term BIPOC or to not use the term BIPOC. This is not a term that I use, so that's why I included the definition for the word racialized. So in a 2020 article, Kika Odo-Thompson, who's the founder and principal consultant of the Kojo Institute, spoke about the then emerging use of the term BIPOC, which means Black and Indigenous people of color. So what Kika pointed out was that BIPOC paints all people of color or racialized people as a homogenous group when really all people have their own experience. So the example that she gave that I think is really poignant and really draws a good picture here is with the overrepresentation of Indigenous people being the largest population and Black people being the second largest population in the criminal justice system in Canada. So if we just use the term BIPOC as a statistical identifier here, it actually would not show how much Black and Indigenous people are overrepresented in the system, but would actually average the number out. So any other person that is in that system that is not necessarily Black or not necessarily Indigenous would average our statistic out. So we really wouldn't get an accurate view about what's going on. So the term can continue to be used, of course, based on context. But this is kind of why you'll hear me use the term racialized, because I try not to use the term BIPOC or POC. Racialized just fits better for my beliefs. If you're going to walk away with anything today, what I want you to remember, and this isn't even the end of the workshop, is that language matters. Using someone's proper pronouns, their proper name, the pronunciation of their name, their descriptors, any general information about them truly matters. If you aren't willing to do this, if you aren't willing to just adjust the words that so that someone's person is valid in a space, you might as well be pretending that they're invisible or they're not there. Ultimately, you're saying, no, you're not a human being. You're what I tell you because I know more about you than you do. It's a really simple way to practice critical allyship that you can start doing right away if it's not something you're already doing, keeping in mind that language matters. This could be the difference between somebody feeling safe and open with you and somebody shutting down. And it's great if you don't have to walk into every space and think about your own mental or even physical safety based on so many varied factors of your identity. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of people actually do. A lot of us can't walk into a space and not consider those pieces. And nobody is performing at their best if they are being constantly hypervigilant. So why practice allyship? Every single person has a role to play here. Diversity and inclusion benefits us all every single day and in every industry. It's how we get new ideas. It's how we get new creativity. It's how we move away from things that don't work to innovation that does. It's how we get a diversity of schools of thought, of input. If we practice allyship and we're able to uplift and listen to the voices of other genders, sexualities, races, religions, backgrounds, countries of origin, bodies, anything, we have access to a diversity of input and experience. We learn, and eventually we live somewhere that feels good and safe, where everyone is included and valued. We're going to talk about power and privilege. Talked a little bit about privilege already. We're going to look at power and privilege because this conversation, sometimes people get a little bit triggered by this one. It's really important to consider when we're talking about critical allyship. Do I have power and privilege? In short, the answer is absolutely yes. Every single one of us has power and privilege in some way. Power and privilege are the intrinsic benefits that we have based on our identity and position, and they are always rooted in systemic oppression of other groups. To be effective and critical allies, it's important for us to recognize and acknowledge where we may have power and privilege and to understand how we can use those things. Ignoring that we have power and privilege, ignoring any of those things actually contributes to the problem, and uplifts the systems of oppression. So I like to use myself as an example. As a member of communities that typically face systemic oppression, racism, homophobia, I also have power and privilege that I have benefited from and that I continue to benefit from. I was able to go to university, which is an institution that's historically racist, sexist, and classist. I work in mental health, which is also another industry that is historically racist, sexist, and classist. Yes, I absolutely worked hard for the things that I do and to get to the place that I am against many odds and some systems of oppression that were stacked against me. However, I also came from a middle class family. Some of my ancestors are settlers. I'm mixed race. I currently have a steady income that allows me to buy devices and internet service to do the work that I do, that allows me to come and do this workshop for folks like yourselves. People who do not have some of the things that I just mentioned potentially have a much harder time or could not access some of the things that I had the privilege to access. And a lot of those things I was able to access purely on my intrinsic identity, and others based on their intrinsic identity could not. Having power and privilege does not mean that things have not been hard, but what it does mean is that my identity and position have contributed to everything I do, and that those ultimately have all been built on the backs of women, of racialized groups, queer folks, and any other person who's faced oppression. So how do I use my power and privilege? Is by acknowledging it. I get to do things like this presentation. I get to practice anti-racism. I bring queer and feminist lenses into my work and into my life, and I always try and advocate the best I can for myself and others. Am I perfect? Absolutely not, and I'm never going to claim that I'm perfect. None of us can be. We're all a work in progress. It's just important to be able to understand where these things come in and how we can use them. So I have a video to show that should show up. Perfect. So this video is a few years old. It's an old BuzzFeed video called The Privilege Walk. So you might have seen this one, but we're going to watch it anyways. It's quite a powerful video. I'm going to give a little bit of a trigger warning that it's not necessarily the most pleasant video to watch. There's nothing violent or anything like that in it. But we're talking about privilege, so it can feel a little bit heavy. So I would encourage everybody to check in with yourselves as we watch the video. Notice what's coming up with you. If you do need to maybe mute the computer for a second to give yourself a bit of a break to come back, please do so, and then we'll have a moment just to all talk together toward as we finish that video. Okay, I'm just going to click play. You should be able to hear.
People are born into families where they have to walk miles just to get water. All I have to do is turn on a faucet. That's privilege. Ever tried to change your speech if you were embarrassed about it? If you never
I think privilege is when some people have some things and other people don't have things.
I feel privilege is something that you don't even really have control over. I think it'd be silly for me to say I don't have a fair amount of privilege, considering like the country I live in, the job I get to do, and the college I was allowed to go to.
I suppose being a white male will help me end up somewhere towards the front, but I'll take a few steps back from being gay.
I don't think I'll make it to the front. I think I'll maybe be in the middle. That's just the gut feeling I have.
If your parents work nights and weekends to support your family, take one step back. If you can show affection for your romantic partner in public without fear of ridicule or violence, take one step forward. If you were embarrassed about your clothes or house while growing up, take one step back. If you have ever been diagnosed as having a physical or mental illness or disability, take one step back. If you have ever been bullied or made fun of based on something you can't change, take one step back. If you get time off for your religious holidays, take one step forward. If you came from a supportive family environment, if you can see a doctor whenever you feel the need, if you're able to move through the world without fear of sexual assault, if you took out loans for your education, if there were more than 50 books in your house right now. So these are your final positions.
think it felt kind of strange for everyone.
It's a hard thing to discuss or even reflect on.
It was very awkward.
I think when you can represent it so visually like this and so immediately, it definitely takes on a new form.
I think we were like all joking around in the beginning. It was pretty lighthearted, and as soon as the questions started coming in, the mood shifted immediately, and we all it was just silent.
Just looking back and seeing like a bunch of people behind you is not a good feeling.
It's like weird how you want to like hold on to explaining a certain privilege, like, oh, but that's not actually me because like I had to work really hard for that. So it's weird to like take a step forward when you feel like you're taking a step forward with someone else, but you wear a lot of the baggage of like how those things were hard.
It was like more emotional than I thought it would be.
It reminded me of when they talk about slavery in high school and you feel like angry for a few days, but then you just realize like this is how it is.
For me, it was kind of frustrating almost to look back and see how much further some people were behind me, and realizing that, a lot of that stuff, no amount of hard work or even legislation can make up that gap.
It's interesting being an Asian American because you're not really sure where you fall on the spectrum of privilege.
I know that for me, one of the reasons I ended up so far back was that there are questions around safety as an African American, as a woman, as a gay woman. There are just so many different ways that I don't feel safe.
I feel like I just learned to be grateful for what you have. We're in such a huge society where it's always complaining about what you don't have.
It just shows you that for some families, like each family, you're meant to do better. My grandparents did good, my parents did good, and I'll do even better.
I do think if you're not like aware of privilege, you should do this exercise, but it's more complicated.
Some people are born into families where they have to walk miles.
Okay, so I'm curious if anybody has any reactions to that video. I see one in the chat already. That I appreciate that they consider a supportive family to be a privilege that often gets overlooked. Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of questions in there that are maybe ways we wouldn't typically think about where power and privilege might come in, but and for sure there's some criticisms of some of the validity or some of the ability of what the video can show, but certainly there's a lot of things in there just to illustrate, seeing this, the person at the very back. I remember watching this the first time, seeing that person at the very back and just feeling devastated. And some of the emotions that come up here, some of the reaction, it's really important to recognize as well at times that when we're practicing things like critical allyship, that a lot of the emotions that we experience actually don't belong to us. The emotions that we experience, the emotions that come up here belong to that group, belong to that person. And we're experiencing that for just a moment when that person's been experiencing it for their entire life. So just something to consider. All of us have privilege. Simply having privilege does not define you. How you wield it does. So let's talk about how-tos. I got another comment there. It was a powerful and meaningful video. Strong message conveyed in a very simple and beautiful way. I absolutely agree. Thank you for that. So how-tos, not everything that everyone does is always helpful, unfortunately. So you could be trying to practice the best sort of allyship that you can, but it's important to consider if you're a help or a hindrance. So you absolutely must know when to ask, when to listen, and when to observe context. There's no one right way, but a simple, can I do something to help go a long way? You ask and you listen. That's how we know how to be a support, how to be an advocate or a shield. Can't talk about the practice of allyship without talking about performance. Performative allyship is a really great blueprint for what not to do. Performative allyship could be something like in the past couple of years when the murder of George Floyd happened in the US and people put a black square on Instagram, but stopped there. It could be somebody wearing an orange shirt on July 1st, stopping there. It could be somebody wearing pink on Anti-Bullying Day, but stopping there. The people who you're trying to perform for when these things happen, the people that you're purporting to support do not get to take down their black square, do not get to take off their orange shirt, and do not get to take off their pink shirt. All of those people enter into every room and every space as their identity, no matter what, and are forced to advocate for themselves just by virtue of existing there. So people's lives and performative allyship intersect in a very violent way, because we're talking about people's lives. It's much more than just looking good for self-gratification. It is much more than patting yourself on the back or checking off a tick box of social responsibility. Performative allyship is violence. So you have to ask yourself, is my action for me, for others, or for the group I'm trying to support? So this is a quote from Resmaa Menakem, who's a healer, therapist, and a licensed clinical social worker in the US. And he specializes in the healing of trauma and is the founder of the Cultural Somatics Institute, which is a cultural trauma and is a cultural trauma navigator, a communal provocateur and coach. So in a 2021 article adapted from his book, The Quaking of America for Psychology Today, he writes about performance. And I'd just like to read a section of the article. So Resmaa writes, suppose you have a white body. At your request, I agree to meet you for lunch and conversation at a convenient restaurant. Soon after we sit down, I begin telling you about the many white friends I have. I mentioned that my brother is married to a white woman, and I laud the comedic talents of Bill Burr, Patton Oswalt, Tina Fey, and Paula Poundstone. When the server comes to take our order, I ask for a roast beef sandwich with mayonnaise and tell him with a big smile, I love mayo, but I can't eat a lot of it. It's just too spicy for me. After he leaves, I lean forward and say to you, man, those shoulder-length blonde locks of his are amazing, aren't they? I almost asked to touch them, but I know better. At what point in my monologue did you begin to question my authenticity? At what point did you sense that I was performing or pandering? At what point did you begin to wonder what was wrong with me? So this conversation maybe sounds ridiculous to some people. I can tell you, I've had the opposite of this conversation many times. Lots of folks have had the opposite of this conversation, where it's been a lot more normalized. So I read that just to kind of highlight where this can come in, where this performance can come in, and how really in maybe what we could say is a bit of a smaller way, it can be violent and it can be damaging. So Resmaa highlights that if you were to walk up to anybody and tell them, I'm your friend, you're automatically going to be suspicious of them. You're automatically going to respond, no, you're not, because you don't know them. So we really have to, again, like we indicated before, practice allyship with the people who we want to be supporting. And we also have to be prepared to make mistakes. We have to be prepared to do things wrong. So critical allyship is so important because everyone deserves to be anywhere, and everybody has the same right to be in those spaces. Most Canadian institutions are historically set up to cater to the white able-bodied male, and they're typically guilty of upholding systemic racism, oppression, ableism, sexism, you name it. These institutions have an increased responsibility to unseat themselves from power and to dig up the roots of systemic oppression that built the foundation of their existence. So what we should be doing is starting to look at our policies, at documentation, how you physically and mentally enter into a space, and I guarantee there is some way that you can practice allyship. Someone once said to me in a similar workshop to this, well, if we change one thing, then we have to change everything. And I didn't really understand why that was a problem. Because if we change one thing and then we realize that we have to change everything, that's probably a pretty good indication that everything needs to change. So if you see something that could be a barrier and you can affect change in some way to better even one person's life or experience, do so. This is the practice of critical allyship. All you can do is oppose an oppressive force, and it can feel disheartening when you don't see those huge systemic or macro level changes, but just know that by practicing allyship, you could change a single person or group's experience, and that's what it's all about, not personal satisfaction. Every person has a part to play because we all make up the whole, and the systemic change you maybe don't see in practicing allyship on an individual level will come as we all participate. We talk about this individual micro level and a trickle up effect into hopefully are institutions that really should be leading the charge, I think we can probably challenge and recognize that they often are not. So let's talk about our environment that we're looking at. So I'm curious, as we're moving toward the end here, I'm wondering if anything has come up for you folks. There are ways that you are thinking about you can practice allyship in your life, in classes, groups, work, anything that's coming up that you wanted to type in the chat box as maybe something that's come up throughout the presentation. It's okay if not as well, because I know there's a lot of content here. It can be a lot to process and a lot to consider. What I'd encourage everybody just to remember is, like I said, we have to be willing to do things wrong, because we will. And that the practice of allyship is micro, meso, and macro. It is individual, it is community, it is government and institution. It is a lot of work. And you started by doing something like this, by coming and sitting in a workshop here. Practicing allyship extends beyond attending a workshop. It's a great start. There's a reason why we don't hand you a certificate as you walk out of here and say, congratulations, you're an ally now, because it's a constant practice and it's a start. So on this slide, it's just a reminder about where and how we might want to start to look at allyship, how we might want to start to look at power and privilege, and just remembering the flip side of privilege being oppression. There's no practice of allyship without the group that you're trying to support. So what is next? And the thing that's next is looking back. You cannot practice critical allyship without knowing what has happened and where we have been. We all have a responsibility to educate ourselves. We all have a responsibility to know this historical context. There are so many different communities, so many different experiences. Not everybody needs or wants the same things. Just because you practice allyship with one community does not mean that you do so to every community. And the way that you practice allyship between communities, between people, likely also have to be different. We received a comment there. Tried to implement compensating people for participating in interviews, recognizing that not everyone will have time to repair if they have multiple jobs or carrying a role. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. I very much appreciate that. What a radical view. And I say that's a radical view because you rarely hear about organizations, about people compensating people for an interview, when oftentimes people have to actually take time out of what they're doing, they're working, or pay for a sitter if they have kids, or daycare or something like that, just to attend an interview so that they can make money, so that they can pay the bills and pay the rent. We all gotta do it. That's a great way of starting to practice allyship. Thank you for sharing that. It's also important to consider if there's ways that you have maybe not practiced allyship in the past, or perhaps upheld a system of oppression. Is there a way to rectify that? Do apologies need to be made? Humbling yourself does not feel good, but neither does oppression. People continue to experience discrimination and oppression even as laws and social norms very slowly change. The impacts of history remain and are not by any means distant. Oppressive or discriminatory immigration laws, laws governing sexuality and gender identity, human bodies, capacity, human rights, slavery, residential schools, colonization, and attitudes about all of these things are not the distant past. They are very much the present, while also being part of history. So being an ally is not something that we can go out and declare, but it is something that can be acknowledged. It is something that we can practice ongoing. And again, with that idea that we can expect to get something wrong at some point. So we can start by espousing the ideals of this practice in your everyday life. We can engage in an active education process in these difficult conversations. We can educate others when we see the chance. We can consider our homes, schools, classes, workplaces, where it's accessible, both mentally and physically, to all where appropriate. What barriers exist, what can be changed. My movers and shakers slide, this is just a few people to follow, some people to read. I believe all of my apps there are all Instagram accounts, and then some really great authors to consume. Desmond Cole actually, his is, I believe he's from Toronto, but most of his book is based around his experiences around kind of like the carding fiasco that was going on with Toronto Police Service and all that stuff. So a really great read. His book, that name is currently escaping me. And Resma Menachem there along the bottom has a lot of really, really informative, great reads as well, was the gentleman I quoted earlier. I also encourage everybody always follow your local Pride or BLM groups. Check out GLAD or the Human Rights Campaign, and any of your local centers and advocacy groups, often underfunded, often do not have enough money to do the work that they do. So I always encourage, please check them out. Oprah's quoted this conversation she had with Maya Angelou several times and has said it was a very important life lesson. When you know better, you do better. So again, even after all this today, all this information, we're not going to be perfect. Nobody is. But history teaches us what we have done wrong, and that's a template from which we learn and grow. Growth and change are good, and it is only through acknowledgement, learning, and education that we have the chance to not repeat history. When you know better, you do better. So thank you for having me. I'm gonna, on this slide here, I've dropped my email.
Well, we are already past 7:30. Again, I don't know where the time went. Thank you again, Lewis. That was really great. And again, so much to think about and reflect on. Thank you everyone for attending tonight's workshop. As we wrap up, I just want to quickly mention some of the other upcoming events open to Mohawk graduates and students. On May 12th, you can join us for a webinar on supporting people with disabilities, misconceptions, and etiquette, and that will be hosted by True Faces. On May 18th, Lewis will be joining with us again for a virtual workshop on diverse communication. And lastly, we are excited to have our golf tournament, the Alumni 9 and Dine, return this year, and that will be on June 3rd. So to sign up for these events, you can visit the website you see on your screen. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining tonight, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening. And thank you again for staying connected with Mohawk College.
Thanks so much, everyone, and thank you, and take
Thank
care.
you.